Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. Episode 45, The Battle of Waterloo, with special guest and Waterloo tour guide, Marcus Cribb. We are very excited today because it is June 17th, the day before the Battle of Waterloo anniversary, and we have joining us our good friend Marcus Cribb once again, so generous with his time. Hello, Marcus.
Hello again. Thank you very much for having me back.
You have such a great intro voice. It's fantastic. So I appreciate you doing this, and tell us what you're going to be doing tomorrow at the battlefield.
Yes, so tomorrow, 18th of June, 2023, on the anniversary, I thought it'd be fantastic to get out to the battlefield. I've been out there quite a few times now, but never on the anniversary. So I will be walking the battlefield with a group. The time of recording, it's quite well booked. So I only limited the places to, I think, to 20. So there only might be a few places left, but
okay,
it's really just about getting out into the battlefield, seeing this time in the time it happened, and obviously we're paying respects to all those involved.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. And for those interested in more exploits of Marcus, you can go to dukeofwellington.org. He has another tour coming up in September in Portugal and Spain, correct?
Yes, another one over there with classic battlefield tours and historian Dan Hill, and we are going to so many battles there, from the sieges of Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, Porto, lines of Torres Vedras. Yeah, we're squeezing a lot, but not too much in, basically, and I'm really looking forward to that one. Yeah. So please do, check that out, or as always, come and find me on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm still working on getting to that one. I may join you on that one.
I'd love to have you there.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. So I thought today, shifting to something different, because I've never done this. We're going to focus on an individual battle, the Battle of Waterloo, since it's the anniversary. And Marcus and I thought we'd do 10 myths or legends about Waterloo that we'd like to dispel or at least discuss. And hopefully my listeners enjoy it.
Excellent. Yeah, this is good. Obviously, you came from doing all the marshals and generals, and now we are looking at the battles. It's Napoleon and ...
Yeah, exactly. So, I guess most people know the story of Waterloo. It was Napoleon's last battle that he commanded himself. It was obviously a loss for Napoleon, and he had abdicated a second time. What is so intriguing about this battle, Marcus? Why do people fixate on it?
You've got a few factors. One, it's undeniable. It is Napoleon. He is one of the big names in history, but also he is facing off against the Duke of Wellington. The two men never met. This is the closest they get to fighting a battle. These are, two of probably the most recognizable names or faces in history, facing off in one of the big battles that really then shapes the world until about the outbreak of the First World War. It draws the map of Europe, apart from the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany wars. But that actually sets some of that in motion as well. It's a blockbuster event, and it really is one of the bookmarks in history that would have changed quite a bit, maybe. Possibly. Yeah, we'll go into that.
Yeah, I was talking to Luke Reynolds about it in a podcast. He just said it's just a nice, tidy battle to wrap everything up, because it has three great captains of the age, Blücher, Wellington, and Napoleon, all going at it. Marshal is there, and it's just such a final ending to such an epic, era, don't you think?
It's actually like the epilogue. It's the postscript. So There's lots of different ways of coming at this one, but it's undeniably one of the most fascinating moments, and it's also got the most what ifs on history as well.
Right,
will fascinate us forever.
Right. Let's start dissecting some of those. We have 10 that I've come up with, and Marcus is gonna help me discuss them. I'll add my input as well. But I guess number one that has always been a bone of contention with me, as great as the victory that it is for England, the British would have won Waterloo with or without the Prussians. I say they would not have. I don't think the Prussians get enough credit. But what is your theory on that, Matt, that they would have won with or without the Prussians?
Well, straight off, I'll say no. they would not have won without the Prussians because they wouldn't have fought without the Prussians. So I think that's the most important thing that is forgotten. Sometimes people wave this and they do kind of like sports match analogies, you know, England fighting France and all this kind of stuff. And it's not football, it's not cricket. Right. It's far more complicated. And the alliance is really important. Quatre Bras, Ligny, Wavre are not just kind of separate battles. They're really integral into the campaign. Wellington wouldn't have fought Waterloo without the Prussians because of the actions in the battles on the 16th of June and the decisions made on the 17th of June. Right. So I think that's really important that Wellington would not have gone there and fought the battle at all if it wasn't for the Prussians. They would not have been his plan. He probably would have retreated northwest towards the coast. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Ligny the 2 days before. The Prussians had a stiff battle with the French, but they lost. But, Blücher, told Wellington he would be there. He would not leave his ally in the lurch. And I think that's, like you just mentioned, that's why Wellington decided to put his foot in the ground and hold that line.
Yes, Wellington said before Ligny he would come to Blücher's aid if he was able to. Now, he wasn't able to because he had to fight Ney at Quatre Bras. And that's still debated. Did Wellington let Blücher down? I would say no, he made it quite clear that actually he wasn't going to be there and Blücher fought independently. He wasn't waiting on Wellington's arrival. And they, two very different battles. Ligny, the Prussians faced Napoleon's might of his guns, really. What Napoleon does best of his hammering with his artillery and sending in columns, right? And faced awful casualties. Whereas at Quatre Bras, it was very different, and it was an Allied strategic victory at so much they contested the crossroads at the end of the day with all sorts of different elements of the alliance coming into play, such as the Duke of Brunswick, the Prince of Orange actually commanding the battle for the morning as well.
Right. Well, let's get into myth number 2, in that the Prussians saved Wellington. Obviously, this is a Prussian point of view. Do you think, I don't know, like if the Prussians hadn't shown up, would have, and Wellington was like engaged with Napoleon, would he have retreated? Would he have stayed in it? Like, do you think the Prussians saved Wellington?
Yeah, this is the one that comes out all the time, especially from the very pro Napoleon camp, kind of trying to put down the Allied effort. No, I don't think the Prussians saved Wellington because it's Allied effort. And I view Waterloo maybe a bit differently to some. This is not a slogging match between the Allies and the French, and then the Prussians come in and save this. What this is, I view it as an Anglo-Allied army, with the core British regiments in there, but so many multi-nations in this line, holding the ridge. They thought, Wellington especially thought, that Napoleon would do something quite clever and flank round at Hull. Right. He had 17,000 troops there. It didn't happen. Wellington did not think Napoleon would just keep coming on, but it was great in many ways, hard pounding this gentleman, he said. But he came in, and it's almost like he drew him into the perfect trap. He bled his army dry, and then a classic swing trap came in, and the Prussians started to roll up the army, drawing in more and more of the French into Plancenoit, and then linking up across Papelotte. And then just as that kind of came in, as the Imperial Guard attack, that the two Allied armies linked together and then rolled across the battlefield. It really was a very good trap if it was designed that way. And I think in many ways that is what Wellington intended. But the view that the Prussians saved Wellington, is probably because the Prussians were delayed in their march. So it left Wellington in limbo and he was critical. If it had happened earlier in the day, we would have just said, fantastic attack, hold, block, attack.
Right. And I think when Blücher and Wellington met up later in the evening, I think at La Belle Alliance, they weren't angry at each other. They just said, what an affair. And they shook each other's hand, Yes. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things it was. I mean, the Belle Alliance was what they thought they could name the battle. And it's the perfect name for it was an Allied victory. But the Prussians were sadly delayed. And that's not me trying to blame them. But that's where I think it's kind of exaggerated that the Prussians saved.
actually, if they'd been much later, it would have been Wellington's Allied army losing. But actually, if they turned up any earlier, we would have just seen a cleaner victory. And it was this moment of what we call the crisis, which is normally about 6 p.m. when Haye Sainte falls, that Wellington's line starts to look quite so perilous.
Indeed. Well, let's move on to number 3. I think this is a interesting one. Napoleon would have kept his throne if he had won at Waterloo.
Yeah.
I don't think so. I think the odds were stacked against him. I mean, he had 200, maybe 300,000 in his army going up against all of Europe with 800, 900,000. Like, the Russians and Austrians were still mobilizing. So I don't know your opinion. I don't think so, though.
I was interested to hear that I don't think he would have either. I think the size of the forces, the Austrians are almost in the theatre of war, and they've got a very sizable force. And the Russians have got about as far as the Rhine, so in Germany. You know, let's remember they take part in the victory campaigns in Occupy Paris. So they are on their way, and they've marched a long way. You've got other forces that want to be part of this fight, especially the Portuguese. They really want to get involved. The Spanish are mobilizing, the Swedish are mobilizing, and Britain is bringing up a lot of reinforcements because we've just finished kind of the War of 1812, even though it's 1815.
Right.
So if Waterloo had been a defeat, if the Prussians had been delayed further, or Wavre had been won, and Wellington had been defeated, Blücher had been defeated, I think we would have seen a Allied reorganization on the coast somewhere near Calais. We would have seen the Prussians fall back east and then reform as best they could with reserves. You would have seen the Austrians come in, then you would have seen the Russians come in, and then you would have seen the British reinforce, which would have been a much smaller force.
Yeah.
Those linking in, I think, even diplomatically, would have been a massive pressure. But I think there would have been another battle probably about a month later that would have been bigger.
Yeah, I think his only hope was to somehow split the alliance apart by, defeating a certain country's armies one at a time, in detail, like he always had been. But I think at this juncture, they were all united in effort against Napoleon.
Yeah, and it's ironic because when they were in Vienna at the Congress, they were very close to war, arguing over some of the territories. And it could have gone south very quickly. But Napoleon's return united the old kind of allies back together. They had no one else to fight. So actually, they were getting close to fighting each other, but Napoleon actually concreted their friendships again. I think it was inevitable. Honestly, I'll go out on a limbo and say that I think Napoleon never stood a chance of victory. I think the allies together, I would love to conjecture what Napoleon was trying to do when he came back. If he wanted another chance of glory, I've heard theories that maybe he was trying to die even in battle and, kind of solidify his myth and legend there himself by dying in battle, kind of like a Valkyrie going to Valhalla. But
Yeah. I mean, he had a glorious 100 days. It probably was nice for him to be back in Paris for even just a little bit to taste that glory again. But I think he would have lost as well, even if he won at Waterloo.
Yeah.
Moving on, number 4. My favorite Marshal is Marshal Ney, and for whatever reason, and if it's Bonapartists or whoever say he did a poor job at Waterloo, I disagree. But I'm going to let you talk on it first.
That's interesting. Okay, so I was going to blame the Bonapartists as well, that saying that Ney did a poor job. And that's not just because the Bonapartists have a lot to answer for sometimes, but they do. I think it's very unfair to blame Ney for Napoleon's defeat. Napoleon was the commander and he lost. So any delegation there really is on him. But Ney, I don't think did a poor job. So Ney was tasked at Quatre-Bras and came very close to victory. This is even I'm just looking at this campaign. Never mind, his fantastic career beforehand.
Correct.
Because that's kind of like the prequel. So Ney does actually quite a good job at Quatre-Bras, given he has some very confusing orders at times. He does have a very long breakfast. Still can't understand that, and should have acted earlier. But I don't think that would have changed the outcome of the battle per se, maybe. But at Waterloo, so he's given far too much criticism for the cavalry attack, actually.
Yeah.
So he's normally criticised. You've probably heard this, that he came forward and he didn't have infantry or artillery. He did.
Yeah,
he did bring them forwards, not in the right numbers, but he did bring them forwards.
Right, and he thought the British were retreating, so that's what you do. You send cavalry.
Yeah, and it's documented that the heavy casualties that the squares had was because of the horse artillery that came up and fired against them with mass ranks.
Yeah.
So it was all-out warfare. The infantry kind of couldn't get into the action because of the mass ranks of the cavalry.
Yeah.
But they were there. So I would say that actually, that was more that the Allied squares, it was both Dutch, Germans, Belgians, as well as British there. But we always think of the Redcoats. They held incredibly well in the face of pressure. If one or two of those squares had gone, it would have probably been, errant.
Yeah.
And they'd gone down to the kind of rally huddle size, some of them. They really did suffer huge casualties, largely from the artillery.
Yeah.
Then he was tasked with capturing La Haye Sainte, which had been attacked all day, and he achieved that.
Yep.
La Haye Sainte fell as I said, about 6 p.m.
Yep.
The relieving columns of the King's German Legion, famously sent down by the Prince of Orange, they were then wiped out, and the 95th Rifles pushed out the sandpit, which is like the supporting position, just up the road. So that was probably the most critical moment for Wellington. He's been under huge pressure. He's received those cavalry charges, which disorganised his troops and caused high level of casualties, and then La Haye Sainte falls. So Ney I thought did quite well overall.
I'm going to go a step further. I'm going to say he was winning the battle. He captured La Haye Sainte, like you said. He was inflicting mass casualties in the ranks with his horse artillery. He even called up extra troops, and Napoleon kind of indignantly said, what do you want me to do, make them? And he had the Imperial Guard standing there at the time. So, he also repelled a cavalry charge. Was it the Scott Greys that got pushed out? I mean, he did his job.
The Union Brigade,
Yeah. So I counter. I think he was about to win. And if Napoleon hadn't hamstrung him with, I can't release the guard yet, I think he might have done it.
It's a really interesting one. I think that probably, I think probably he was doing a very good job, and he was leading very much from the front, very different style, and he's becoming a bit of a scapegoat in this.
I agree, and that leads me into number 5 in terms of scapegoats. This is probably the most famous one of all the Waterloo myths and Bonapartists and all that, and that Grouchy should have marched to the sound of the cannons instead of engaging with the Prussians at Wavre. Your thoughts on that one?
Well, his orders were to march to Wavre, and my understanding of it, he was given a very confusing orders, which, if you read it literally, was kind of go to march east, but then they were confusing the left and the right flanks of the river. So he was doing as he was ordered. Though he was obviously a marshal, was meant to use his initiative. Napoleon was very much in command of that campaign, and he was following his orders. And actually, his orders to fight and hold around Wavre, we just think of them blocking and moving. Actually, there was really hard fighting in the city, especially around the bridge of the town. So I think he was following his orders and did as he needed to. And actually, by the time he was involved in that, there wasn't really that much time to kind of disentangle himself and get back to Mont Saint Jean, to Waterloo.
Right.
What do you kind of think on this one?
Yeah, and I read an article that actually the day before he had seen Ney get admonished for not following his orders at Quatre Bras. And so he was probably in the back of his mind thinking, well, I better follow my orders to the letter and not deviate from what Napoleon tells me. So I'll stay here at Wavre. I hear the cannons, and I know Van Dam and Gerard are yelling at me to go back there, but I'm just going to follow my orders. And he won the battle, and he got his corps back to Paris intact. So I think he gets way, way, way too much blame on this one.
Yeah, I think there's a case of scapegoating the marshals for Napoleon's failures. And it's interesting you mentioned about blaming onto Ney. That links us to one a bit later on that I've made a note of. But yeah, I think we've got to remember who's in command here, and Napoleon's style, coupled with his health, Arguably, I strongly believe the medical evidence is showing that Napoleon is suffering, early symptoms of stomach cancer here.
Mm-hmm.
He's unwell. He's got piles and hemorrhoids. He's got massive crippling stomach pain,
right.
And he's just generally unwell and quite lethargic. And I think he's kind of when somebody's in pain, they become quite, angry, grumpy, whatever the word you want to use. You can lash out at people.
Right.
If you've got a massive headache, stomach ache, you take that out on somebody. And I think we see elements of that here, that he's putting down his marshals around him.
Right. And it's, to me, like in America, it's like blaming your assistant coaches instead of the head coach of a football team or a soccer team, like,
yeah. Who's in charge? Who's the boss?
Right. Exactly. So, yeah.
And you can only ever have one commander in a battle if it goes well, if you want it to go well. We've seen a few examples where people try to kind of co-command, and it doesn't really work. You need one person ultimately making a decision. It's not a democracy. Everyone doesn't have an equal vote. We have a military rank structure.
Yeah, if Wellington had lost the battle, I don't think the blame would have gone on Hill or Barris or Picton or
No, that wouldn't have come for a second, would it? And we don't talk about those as the victors either, do we? We talk about Wellington.
Correct.
If Napoleon had won, we wouldn't have been going, Grouchy, you did a fantastic job, and Ney was brilliant. We'd be going, Napoleon this and Napoleon that.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, good point. Moving on. This one, the Haye Sainte, we mentioned it earlier, and Hougoumont we should discuss as well. These were two buildings that were on the battlefield, and Wellington, put garrisons within both of them, and one fell and one didn't. And I wanted to say, did Wellington wisely use and support Haye Sainte? I think he used it wisely. On the support side, though, I think maybe it's just too many Frenchmen and they couldn't repel them wave after wave when they ran out of ammunition.
Yeah, I mean, out of all the farms that he used, the key ones being Haye Sainte and Hougoumont, and Hougoumont is such a special place to visit. It really is one of my favorite places to visit anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And Haye Sainte's still in private hands, and it very rarely opens up. And I've seen a few calls recently of people saying, "Oh, it should open." It's in private hands. It's in private hands.
Right.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
And there's lots of plaques on the outside, so it's incredibly similar in many ways. They both suffered multiple break-ins and kind of pushing out, and both had quite mixed forces, actually. It wasn't just the guards at Hougoumont. There were allied forces there as well, but it's a very special place for the guards to visit. Haye Sainte being defended by King's German Legion, who were veteran soldiers, I would say kind of near that elite status. They had a mix of muskets and rifles inside, and its support. So it's supported quite closely from the ridge. It's closer to the main Allied positions than Hougoumont, which was down the sunken lane, and had what we'd say in the army is position in depth. So it's directly supported by the 95th Rifles in the sandpit. And what position in depth means that basically as you attack Haye Sainte, you can be fired directly upon by the sandpits. 300 yards for a rifleman. Haye Sainte's kind of just a bit less than that. So if you're breaking down the doors, actually, if you turn to your right-hand side, you can see the sandpit and you can be shot at from there. So from that point of view, it's well supported. The interesting one comes when they start to run out of ammunition.
Right.
And they're not given enough the correct supplies. Whereas at Hougoumont, the driver breaks through with the supplies for the Royal Corps transport. So they get that. Could he have put more men in? Well, actually, you can't put that many men into tight buildings and expect them to be able to operate. They need freedom of movement. As the position fell, the Prince of Orange famously sends forwards 3 battalions of King's German Legion who don't see the French cuirassiers and are cut down. Which in turn we see lots of criticism of the Prince of Orange for that, but it's in a little bit of dead ground. It's quite close, so it's one for another time to debate, maybe. Right. But I don't know. I mean, Haye Sainte fell. It's a matter of fact. It was fiercely fought over.
Right.
I think it's one of these ones that was almost inevitable. If you rewind even as far as the night before, but they burnt their own gates because they didn't think they were going to stay there, and it was a massive pressure on Haye Sainte because it's in the center of the line as well.
Yeah, and I want to just call it the bravery of the King's German Legion. And the soldiers, I mean, they probably knew it was a suicide mission. Like we're all going to die here. They kind of like the Alamo, but they stayed at their posts. And
And there was an element of that. I mean, when the building was burning around them and they were still defending it with basically like one shot in the barrel and bayonet.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, you know, King's German Legion, incredibly brave, tough soldiers, originally Hanoverian origins, fighting for the Elector of Hanover, which happened to be King George. Mm-hmm. But as the French are coming in, they are having shouts of no mercy, and prisoners are executed and killed there. That's German prisoners executed by the French. So it was not a nice, clean fight. This is really brutal, really hand to hand going. And so they don't think they in any way did they let it fall. They fought up probably beyond where most men could have. Only a few managed to escape, and even that they actually ran through a burning building to escape. So yeah, good shout to honour those men.
Yeah, indeed. Moving on, number 7. This is a big controversial one too. Is that Napoleon should have started the attack earlier. Those of you who know your Waterloo history, there was a big thunderstorm day before. The water, it was a huge storm. The fields were soaked. It was very muddy. So Napoleon, on the advice of his artillerymen, decided to postpone the start of the battle.
Yeah, huge thunderstorms. This is because of the Indonesian volcano that went off that summer that changed the atmosphere. So the volcano that might change the course of history. Mm-hmm. The two ones here is one, it was waterlogged, and what Napoleon could have done, he possibly delayed the battle because he wanted to form up his grand battery. Mm-hmm. That's kind of putting together, we think, somewhere between 60 to 90 guns. We can't quite tell, but it was certainly a sizable amount of guns together in one collective near D'Erlon's Corps and attacking there with a massive bombardment. So that was delayed, probably. The other one that isn't really given enough attention is that actually the army was still strung out along the road from the day's march the day before. Mm-hmm. The night before. So they weren't actually in position. So the weather played a factor, but actually there were still men kind of moving up the road. This is really confusing. There's, not actually many torches being lit. Certainly we're hundreds of years before anything like night vision goggles and that kind of command and control. Right. And radios and things that help you, and mobile phones and WhatsApp that we all use today. Right. So they genuinely were struggling to move along that road. So it reached a point that the French army was getting kind of snarled up, and then were just kind of camping out where they were, as they weren't actually far enough up. So Napoleon should have started some sort of attack earlier, probably, to start applying the pressure. Mm-hmm. Wellington certainly thought he was going to. The army stood to at dawn. Mm-hmm. The bit going of how he could have done that without the main pressure of his army, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, and the reason the artillerymen wanted to hold off is, cannonballs generally cause more damage when they bounce off the ground, and they kind of skip through.
They skim like a cricket ball.
Right, like a regiment, and just plow through like an entire body of soldiers. But due to the mud, they were just being fired and like landing and not moving. They were just bedding in the mud.
And it's really clayey soil there as well, just to be clear for anyone who hasn't visited. If it starts to rain, it's really claggy, solid, clunky soil. It's not just wet.
See, I'm glad you told us that, because I've never been there. So I'm glad you have that firsthand experience. But also just, maneuvering troops is hard in wet, soggy mud. So if Napoleon's planning this intricate frontal assault, he needs freedom of movement for his infantry. So I get why he waited, but you're right. He should have done either a probing or some sort of skirmishing much earlier in the day.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not a general, and I'd hate to be an armchair general, but I think he could have done something to start the action and start applying pressure. Yeah, like you say, like some sort of probing attack, a feint. Arguably Hougoumont was the first action at 10 o'clock. That could have been earlier with different forces. So yeah, it's certainly one should he have done, but I think the big one there is actually kind of the myth is that it was just the mud. There was actually an element for the night before there as well.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Moving on, this one also, I hear a lot about this one. Number 8 is Napoleon should have employed Marshal Davout and Marshal Murat at Waterloo. Famously, Davout was left back in Paris as Minister of War because it was really the only man Napoleon could trust in Paris. And Murat was turned away after his treachery in 1814. What do you think? Would this have made any difference to have these two?
Probably. But I mean, Murat's going to be almost impossible because he's down in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, by this point, he's thrown his hat in and gone into fighting. He's gone into fighting quite early, and he's basically lost by the time that Waterloo's coming about and
Right.
being executed for. So it's really difficult for him to have actually had any effect at all, whether Wellington wants him or not.
Yeah, I've read about this, and I've read that Napoleon said if Murat was there, he might have broken 1 or 2 squares of English infantry, and that's all I needed. But I don't know if one man could have done that. I mean, as you know, British infantry squares were notoriously impossible to break.
Yeah, and I don't think that the cavalry would have had a better effect because of the way they would have led, as opposed to Ney. Once they're actually away from the general, the orders are given, they're attacking the squares. Right. You're into regimental and subunit level fighting, maybe even brigade. But I don't think it would have made that big a difference. Murat has probably more faults than he does positives in many ways. You'll know he's quite an egotistical one, but I don't think he could have been employed. I don't think it was physically possible.
No, I agree. And Davout's the interesting
Davout, the Iron Marshal. I'd be interested to hear. Actually, please, can you see what you think?
Yeah. I mean, if he was a commander instead of Grushev, would he have returned? Probably. Would it made a difference? Probably not. But I don't know if Davout would have made a huge difference. I still think Ney would have been put in charge of the main thrust at Waterloo.
Do you think Davout would have replaced Soult as chief of staff? Or?
Yeah, maybe, and probably would have issued a lot clearer orders. Yeah, that's a good point. But even that, would that have turned the tide? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know if one person would make such a difference.
Yeah.
There's the famous quotes there, isn't there, that Wellington thought that Napoleon was worth 20,000 men on the field.
Right.
40,000 men on the field. And then Wellington's own men said they'd rather see Wellington than 20,000 reinforcements.
Yeah.
But actually, 40,000 or 20,000 men would have made probably as much difference once some of the action starts to take place. I think Davout probably would have made a difference to the campaign if he'd been like a corps commander. Mm-hmm. And the other one I would always, put in is Berthier and what happened to Berthier, as a very competent chief of staff and not being there for quite obvious reasons.
Yeah, but again, it harks back to football or soccer. You play with the players that are available. You don't lament the guys that are injured or not on the pitch.
Yeah, and I think my main one comes down to my limited military experience. A general visits you and says, "Oh, how you all doing, guys and girls? Are you okay?" And then as soon as you are back into your foxhole and stuff, you kind of forget about that. It's about the guys around you, the girls and guys that you're working with. So actually, the grand strategy, who's actually on the horse puffing you on, only has some very limited effects. When there's a cannonball coming towards you, how much is your leader really having an effect there? Right. It's about the grand strategy, isn't it? And actually, the grand strategies were quite well laid out by both sides.
Right.
It was then kind of the later reactions of Napoleon and Wellington that kind of, wrote history, I'd say.
Yeah. And Napoleon had some very competent corps commanders, like you mentioned earlier, D'Erlon and Kellerman was with the cavalry, and there were some good soldiers that Napoleon still had on his side. Yeah,
he certainly had some very good and very experienced both commanders and troops. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that different generals weren't important. That's not the case of what I was trying to say.
No.
But I was just kind of thinking. But there's some who reacted very well, and basically, I think the strategy was slightly flawed, given the fact that the counter strategy, Wellington's strategy, not Blücher's strategy, to hold the ridge and then come in. And I say that just clarify the other side, because Wellington came up with the strategy and wrote to the Prussian headquarters, and that was enacted on the 17th of June when Blücher was actually injured. So it wasn't it was part of, as much as I believe in the alliance, it wasn't Blücher at that moment. He was incapacitated. He'd fallen off his horse and hurt himself 3 times. Right. 3 times. I mean, brave man, a tough man. But yeah. Would one man have made a difference? I mean, if anyone would have, it probably would have been Davout. Yeah. But then, I think Berthier, and I think a lot's got to be done for staff officers there. But the army Napoleon was given, it wasn't his most elite army, but it was actually probably better than his army in like 1813, 1814, when it was purely conscripts. So, yeah.
And you make a good point there that, the Grand Army was somewhat rusty. A lot of these guys hadn't worked with each other, and Marshal Soult was new to the role. And you saw even at Ligny when, was it D'Erlon's who was marching back and forth all day between Quatre Bras and Ligny? There was just a lot of miscommunication and poor orders going on in Napoleon's army at that time.
Yeah. Effectively, it comes down to what I love about Waterloo is there's so many what ifs. If it hadn't rained, if Grouchy hadn't done this, and I think that's why Waterloo will continue to fascinate us.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me move on to number 9 and 10 here. Number 9 being Napoleon should have rallied his troops for another try the next day.
Yeah. So we kind of get to the end of the battle. Is the troops starting to flee. Now, Napoleon does want to carry on fighting, but he actually heads off at quite a speed. He has to move between his carriage onto his horse, and as far as I'm aware, he actually almost gets captured by the Prussians, and they get his carriage. They certainly get his sword, which ended up back at Apsley House. And the story used to go that a Prussian soldier grabbed his sword and Napoleon unbuckled it, but I'm not sure how much truth there was in that. But certainly made for a good story.
Right.
So how able they were to rally. So in the follow-up, it was agreed that the Allied army, the Anglo-Allied army, was exhausted, and they were going to kind of rest and then march on the next day. The Prussians carried on the pursuit. They did things like they mounted drummers onto horses, so it sounded like the infantry were really close behind. They also executed prisoners as well. The Prussians were very brutal in that. There were rearguard actions by the French army, certainly at key bridges. I think it was almost impossible. I think the flight at about 7:30, 8 p.m, when the French army starts to break, it becomes a bit of a torrent. Should he have done? Yes, he probably should have done.
And I've read that he did try. He tried to rally him on a few bridges, but I think once the invincible Imperial Guard broke, I think that just scared the wits out of the French army. And they said, enough's enough. We're just running all the way back to Paris. We're done.
Yeah. I mean, that's another myth, isn't it? That the Imperial Guard fought to the last man. They didn't. Some of them surrendered, and some of them fled, and some of them fought. And seeing that, and seeing a lot of casualties on both sides, and a long day's fighting, and I think especially the troops there probably would have been under the impression that actually fighting with Napoleon, they would have been unbeatable. That Napoleon was unbeatable. This was a big rallying cry. So actually, I think they thought, it's a really tough day, but eventually we're going to win. And then that myth that they kind of thought that there was a rumor, wasn't it, that Grouchy had arrived and was attacking them on the eastern flank, and then they realized it was the Prussians, and then they realized that the numbers were coming against them, and the fighting in the town of Plancenoit was awful.
Yeah,
I think morale was on the down, and actually once you start to get that kind of routing fever as such, that people wanted to run. So the fact there was any rearguard action was definitely down to those more junior commanders who were able to do that. Napoleon, he should have rallied his troops. I don't think he was able to. Everyone knows that I'm not Napoleon's biggest fan. I don't think actually that's against him. I don't think he was actually able to have that effect.
Yep, I agree. Number 10, it was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars.
No,
but I think people it is the last huge battle. I will say that, but it's not the last battle.
It's not the last battle. I mean, most immediately you've got there's a campaign towards Paris. It actually goes on into quite late July, and that campaign goes on. Napoleon himself wanted to carry on the campaign for quite a while. But it's not possible. But they fight into July, and famously Saint-Denis, a suburb of Paris. And so that carries on, that both the Prussians and the British end up down there.
Mm.
So the fighting doesn't finish on the 18th of June. It does carry on for a good 3 weeks there. And, there's the wider conflict as well, I'm sure you're going to say.
Yeah, no, there's some good rearguard actions. General Excelmans gives the Prussians a bloody nose. Davout still has a large army of National Guard that he can call on. But yeah, I think for all intents and purposes, it was the end of the Napoleonic Wars, even though there was a few skirmishes on some of the frontiers as well. I know General Rapp pushed back some Austrians, Suchet.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was other stuff going on.
There was, and there was multiple forts of the French that held out for quite a while. But it's not the end, actually. The Paris campaign doesn't receive much highlights, but the writings on the wall. Napoleon heads back to Paris and says that he wants to carry on fighting, and effectively his own parliament said, no, that's not really what's going to happen now, I'm afraid. Do you want to consider leaving, or do you want to consider surrendering? Those are your two options. Right.
Well, let's jump. We have 2 bonus myths. You guys thought we were done. We have 2 more for you. The first bonus myth is Napoleon surrendered that day at Waterloo.
Yes, thank you, Ben and Bjorn from ABBA. I refrained from singing it, but he says, "Whoa, Napoleon did surrender there." I think you've won. I've lost the war. Quote. He doesn't. He makes it to Paris, as I said, and he makes it then on to the Billy Ruffian, as we call it, HMS Bellerophon, which is on the coast in July. And so this is actually mid to late July. And by all intents and purposes, we believe that Napoleon was trying to flee to America. It's quite a big French colony out in America. And he's blockaded in by HMS Bellerophon. And he then actually goes onto deck and surrenders to Captain Maitland, I think a distant relative of General Maitland, but not a close relative, but Maitland, they won't stand, fame of the guards, and he surrenders to him. So actually a naval captain, which is equivalent to an army colonel, so not a senior officer, actually, not very high officer, and surrenders there on board the Royal Navy's deck.
Yeah, you do wonder though, if he would have just made a break for it, would he have made it to America? And if so, if he made it, what would he have done there? Would he have become a quiet private citizen, or would he cause trouble in America too? You don't know. Yeah,
I mean, I'd be interested to know as well, because there was the colony of vines and olives, which a lot of French generals went out to, and they tried to farm. There is actually a fiction series of Napoleon in America, which is highly recommended. I know, very well researched. So that's one I really do want to pick up one day, because I know the author does a lot of good research. So it's wrong of me to have not picked up the book yet.
Yeah, no, I've seen that as well. And then my added bonus question, and this is highly debatable. I don't want anyone really angry at me, but Waterloo is the greatest song by ABBA, Swedish.
I thought a Super Trooper.
No. I think it's Take a Chance, maybe Fernando, Mamma Mia, but some people are very adamant that Waterloo is their greatest hit. What is your thought?
Do you know what? It's probably one of the earliest military history songs in pop culture. It could well be. They're one of the greatest. It's certainly one of the most famous, certainly one of the most hummed ones.
Yeah.
And when I briefly dabbled with reenactment, we had a very down-to-earth guy who played Napoleon in Britain. And yes, we did sing Waterloo to him when he parades past.
It is a very catchy song, I will say.
It's really catchy, isn't it? It's it's a real earworm. It gets stuck, and I'm really struggling not to hum it right now, because I'm certainly not going to sing.
Indeed. No, I just want to get that one in there. But that was very informative. I think we covered a lot of the myths that are out there and legends. It is an intriguing battle. I know it has more research than all the other ones. Frankly, I think the Battle of Leipzig is more pivotal than Waterloo, but I know Waterloo gets all the attention.
Yeah, I mean, I've given this a lot of debate with online and with friends and colleagues, and I know Zach White's done a bit on it. It wasn't that important, and to an element, I agree. It wasn't the be all end all. I think we said earlier, there would have been other battles that would have defeated Napoleon, but it's such an important landmark event in history. Not only did so many men die, but it helped write history. And all of these what ifs and myths keep people coming back time and time again.
Just to wrap up here, since you're doing the tour tomorrow, how should one visit the battlefield? Is it a several day thing? Should you get a hotel in Brussels? Like, well, how do you usually recommend people visit the battlefield?
Yeah, I'd definitely say 2 days.
Okay.
2 days minimum. One day. So the summary is, if you have 1 day, you can basically go and see the main museum. You can walk up the Lion's Mound. You can. They normally have reenactors there, fire a cannon and do a quick demonstration, and then you probably get as far as Hougoumont on one of the tickets, and you might get to either Napoleon or Wellington's headquarters. But that's kind of your day out. I would say that's probably day one. Day two, park up back at the museum, get on your hiking boots and walk it. It's achievable, but there are no toilet breaks. It's a walk in a day. And that's what I'm going to do on the 18th of June. It's what I love taking groups out there to do. It's fantastic. There's a real clockwise loop that you can follow. I really need to write it up as a pamphlet or something. But it's all achievable. It's all on tracks. The only thing I say is, it's lots of cobbles and dusty roads and some shale and stuff. So you do want, and then there's tarmac. You really do want a good pair of boots and a bottle of water with you and good bladder control. But it's really worth doing in a day. If I took my partially sighted father there, who's pushing on his late 60s, and he did it in we did it at 30 degrees in August, then most people should be able to do it. And it's the best way to feel connected with the battle. It's the best way to appreciate the ground. And there's a lot of memorials to units as you go around. So you can pay homage and respects to both individual units, but also stands, where such important history took place.
Right. No, I've never been, so I appreciate you sharing that with me. And I'd really like to see it sometime soon. So.
I'd love to take you or show you there if I could. Yeah. One day we'll make that happen.
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, it's fascinating. Well, thank you, my friend, as always, for this great episode again. And I hope my listeners enjoyed it.